Hi, everybody. This is Anoop, and today I have as my guest James Barnes. And let me tell you a little bit about James. We're going to be exploring mind, psychotherapy, world, reality, and the notion of a mental disorder. So basically everything. So James is a psychotherapist and mental health advocate based in Exeter, UK, who has a background in philosophy and psychoanalysis. He's currently working on reimagining the nature of mental disorder from a non-Cartesian starting point in order to advocate for non-reductive strategies of healing and recovery. Fantastic and insightful. I came across James maybe 1 or 2 years ago on Twitter. I'm not sure how, but he showed up in my feed, and I'm glad he did. I find that he has insightful perspectives on mind, world, and the practice of psychotherapy. And so I've invited him on the program here. James, yeah, I noted that when I was looking at these tweets that you were commenting on everything from the nature of mind, the nature of psychotherapy, and that really reflects in your bio. Can you tell me a little bit about reimagining the nature of mental disorder?
Yeah, the bio intro is a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, I think I obviously followed you for a while as well, and so I know that you share some of these views, although we come from a different standpoint. But the model that we have in terms of mental health, particularly, and psychology in general, is Cartesian in the sense that experience is thought to be located in the mind or the brain, and the outside world is kind of this sort of neutral set of atoms that doesn't really have any quality to it, and therefore the kinds of experiences that we have that get labeled as mental disorder are issues with something going wrong internally in the brain or the mind, and the outside world is kind of irrelevant, or it can be a trigger for something going on internally. But that model is very prevalent. That there isn't much outside of that, and that to me is a overly pathological way of looking at it. It locates the problem in the individual, it locates the solution in what the individual can do, it puts all the responsibility on them, and it kind of diminishes and avoids greater issues, in my opinion, such as the social circumstances, the experiential and relational circumstances that give rise to this kind of suffering. So I've been looking at different kinds of models, different kinds of people, different kinds of philosophies that can kind of make sense of a different kind of picture based on the most kind of radical basic level, which is the philosophical structure, like what is a mind, what is experience, what is the world, which then leads on to how you think about mental disorder. So it's a pretty big project in many ways, but there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Yeah.
And I think I personally believe we're at a turning point at the moment, a kind of paradigm shift of sorts. And so I think it's gathering momentum, different aspects of that. Yeah.
Wow, you listed some huge questions. What is mind? What is world? I love that because that's where I like to play as well.
Yeah.
Before we get into those questions, how did you come to this? Like, how did you come to examine life so deeply and also start communicating about it?
Yeah, I mean, me, like most people, have a kind of long story. But, I've been involved in mental health for a while. I've had mental health issues myself and been through a lot of therapy. And so I have kind of first-hand experience of a lot of different experiences and states and things like that. But I was interested in philosophy and psychology from quite a young age, and got into Vedanta, which I know you're very into and very proficient on. Sort of in my early 20s, went to San Francisco, studied some really interesting stuff there, as you can imagine, being San Francisco. And then came back here fairly recently after training as a psychotherapist, with a mind to not just work with clients, but actually kind of promote a different way of understanding and kind of ride this wave that I see happening and hopefully participate in it.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing at the moment, the mental health crisis that's happening. And
right.
I think we're going at it from the wrong way, and so I think it's it's
Right,
something very valuable to be involved in.
right. You mentioned that you had your own experiences, your mental health experiences. I wonder even, I had my own experiences, and I
Yeah,
wonder where is the line between mental health and mental illness, or order and disorder? Is there a line? What defines it? I don't know. Can you give me some insight into that?
yeah, it's a very very tricky question. I've come to reject the term mental disorder largely because it has medical connotations, and it specifically, or usually specifically, refers to something that's gone wrong in the mind or the brain, therefore eliminating all this other stuff that we're talking about. Um, so I don't think of it in terms of disorder and not disorder. I think there obviously are kinds of disorders, but they are physical issues. And I think the mental issues, the kinds of things we talk about, depression, anxiety, psychosis, things like that, um, I think that they obviously involve a lot of suffering, or can do. They are obviously different to a lot of what other people experience in terms of the severity, but I see them as continuous with normal experience. So I don't see that there's a categorical differentiation even with psychosis. I think
Mhm.
people hear voices even in religious experience, religious settings, even normally voices are kind of normal, as is paranoia and stuff like that. So I don't see a categorical
Yeah.
distinction in that way.
It seems like we're getting into this territory of what is real and what
Mhm.
is not real. Like if I hear a voice, how do we determine whether it's a real voice or not a real voice? I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that? What is real versus unreal?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. The voice one is particularly tricky. Um, I mean, some of the ways that I've heard it talked about, which I follow in some ways, that we quote unquote hear our internal thoughts. We talk to ourselves internally without speaking it. So is it categorically different to that? I would I haven't heard voices, so I don't know, but it's certainly a huge extension of that. But I don't take it to be necessarily different. It's sort of internal. Well, then we get into the tricky use of internal versus external. But um, I find it hard to make that kind of distinction with voices. It's
Yeah.
really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I see that all of these are basically conditions,
Hmm.
including, as you said, internal, external, or, a thought that we sense versus a thought that we hear.
Yeah.
They're like slightly different qualities of sensing.
Hmm.
I wonder about this distinction of real and unreal. I think about the word hallucinations when I see
Yeah.
patients in the emergency department, and then we say, okay, this person's having hallucinations. Like,
Hmm.
how exactly do we define that real, unreal? It's an interesting question. The other thing that came to mind as you were talking about your own experience, you mentioned your 20s.
Hmm.
And, I wonder in your experience as a psychotherapist, if you see that in people that you've talked to and in your experience as a important decade, as where there's some kind of transformation happening. Because I know
Yeah.
for me, the 20s also were a transformative decade.
Yeah.
So especially the late 20s. So what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. When I went to San Francisco, I was 28, going through 30 and those times. And in San Francisco, people are very astrologically minded, and
Okay.
they talk about the Saturn return and all of that. So I became familiar with that. And I do look back on it in that way now, and see it in some way like that. My 20s, early 20s were very challenging. A lot of difficult stuff happened. And at the same time, I was very, very interested in a lot of different ideas. And it kind of culminated in something that shifted in me at the end of my 20s and then into my 30s. And then I changed quite a lot then.
Hmm.
So I definitely do see that. And I also think it's interesting on on the topic of the things we're talking about, that often people that get diagnosed with schizophrenia will be late teens, early 20s. And it's at a time when there is something very existentially poignant and profound happening in terms of your orientation towards the world. So I do want to make that link, that there is it is a time in which lots of paths can happen, and I wouldn't want to necessarily talk about them in terms of like, you know, a something internal is triggered, rather than experiences in the world you're having are different. I mean, it's a very different thing being in your 20s to being in your teens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that depending on one's family structure, you know, the kind of adults that are around you, or the support structure, and also the beliefs and the, you know, their own philosophical output, philosophical perspective rather, even if it's not articulated in thoughts, but just the way they sense the
Yeah.
world. I would think that that would have an impact, especially if the line between order and disorder is thin, on
Hmm.
exactly how that's interpreted and the development of that human being.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. I think that's one of the things that gets left out of the disorder, in my mind. The disorder kind of perspective is that, you know, those experiences are always couched in a relational scene, you know, like the grand relational scene of the society and all the ways of knowing and things that are given to be true or untrue, real and not real by society, but also the smaller micro societies of families and friendships and the world views they have. And so I think that's all really, really important. And I think, yeah, absolutely makes a difference what kind of cluster of views you're in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Well, you know, what I did is I went through a couple of your articles that you've written, and I just wrote down a few quotes that I found very meaningful, and wonder if you could just teach us about them and, you know, just expand on them in whatever direction you think is helpful.
Brilliant.
The first thing I want to touch on is actually a few words from your bio, because I think that itself could fill up an entire talk. So when you say a non-Cartesian starting point,
Yeah.
what does that mean to the audience?
Okay. Yeah. So as I was kind of touching on at the beginning, I think the models we have, despite the talk of, you know, Descartes and dualism being, you know, this kind of silly philosophical mistake some time ago, I think the kind of materialistic uh, philosophy we have at the moment still remains dualistic. It still remains the same thing. They've just kind of eliminated the separate substance, and now it's this brain or a mind that's reducible to the brain, but it's still very, very similar philosophical setup, in which, as I was saying, the world is this kind of neutral, purposeless, meaningless thing, and we, with our internal experience, attribute all qualities to it, all purpose, all meaning, and therefore anything that's disordered that has those things as its content is something that's wrong internally. So that is what I take to be the Cartesian perspective, and I put psychiatry in that, certainly biomedical psychiatry, because they're looking for the location of the problem in the brain, or genes or things like that, and but also things like CBT.
That's
There's
cognitive behavioral therapy.
yeah,
Yeah.
cognitive behavioral therapy, which at least in its kind of classic form, you know, accepts there's something wrong with the way that you think, and you're trying to change the way somebody thinks, and you're not really paying attention to the relational circumstances these thoughts come up in, the field of experience in which thinking pops out, you know. So that's what I mean by Cartesian, and non-Cartesian is, you know, potentially anything else.
Yeah. So the Cartesian specifically refers to, is it René Descartes? And
Yes.
this was René Descartes' initial idea of dividing the world into experience, mind-like experience, and something outside of experience that we call matter. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. There's a really interesting story associated with it. Actually, I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm getting too
No, no,
too.
go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, but I think I described some of it in the article, where at the time, and I don't put it on Descartes specifically because it's a shift, it's a paradigm shift, and Descartes formulated something, but it was the time of Isaac Newton and the time of the sort of discovery of the physical laws of the universe, and this was very threatening, particularly to Christianity, to religion, to the divine world, to God's domain as the world. And so a very sort of brief kind of caricatured version of that story is that Descartes, or that kind of philosophy, they saw the need to withdraw all of that meaning and all of that divinity into the person, into the mind, into the soul. It's where God gets very transcendent. He's not really immanent anymore. And so it's all taken in to protect it from science, protect it from the mechanistic view put forward by Newton. And essentially that model persists. So all experience, all quality, all meaning is inside or in relationship to God, although that's been got rid of by a lot of people in the West now. And the world is just this kind of bunch of, meaningless atoms. And that he framed in terms of two substances, the mental substance and the physical substance. And they're two separate things, which interact or don't, because it doesn't actually work. But that was what he brought into it. And in a sense, Western philosophy since Descartes has all been trying to figure out that picture. Yeah.
It's interesting because when you put it that way, I look at what I learned in medical school and what I hear being talked about a lot in psychiatry, and even just generally in popular culture. I mean, this is not restricted to academia. It's just the story that gets published even in the media, the popular story about the nature of the world. And all of this is not necessarily based in research. It's not based in something fundamental. It's basically the way a person and a group of people experience the world and then thought about how they should describe it and how they should approach it. It's really like, it's an opinion. It's a way of experiencing an opinion that is entirely based on the cultural milieu, the personal experiences.
Yeah.
So how did that become dominant as opposed to, we know in Eastern traditions and other traditions, there has been for millennia established other perspectives on not only how to experience the world, but how to articulate it, think about it, and approach it. So why do you think it's called Cartesian? Why did it become this perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, its dominance is down to science. I mean, science has been science which assumes, or it has to assume that picture is true of the world in order to do the kinds of massively extensive stuff, research, time, money spent on it. It has to kind of forget that it's a position and think of it as reality in order to do what it does. And it's been incredibly, incredibly successful, as we all know. Like the technology that's come from that is, it's unfathomably genius in many ways. But along with that, I would say that there was a necessary forgetting that it's an opinion, like you say, that it's a philosophical position, and an ignoring of the impacts of that forgetting, such as the degradation of the environment. I mean, of human populations in many ways. There's so much that you could say that's happened as a result of that, that to me is a result of the forgetting, but it is an incredibly powerful thing.
Yeah. As you're saying this, I was looking at this other phrase that you used. Non-Cartesian was the first one, and the other one is non-reductive strategy. So does the reduction there that's referred to, is this reduction of the whole world into this dualist perspective, mind and matter? Is that what you mean by reduction? And so would non-reduction then be the reintegration of that?
In some way, yeah, I think, yes. But I was trying to refer to, with regards to mental health, the kind of reductive strategies, which would be like in biopsychiatry, where the strategy is to deal with the brain. It's outside of the context, or even with cognitive behavioral therapy to deal with the thought patterns rather than the context. But yeah, I think that, the whole picture is reductive, and in the sense that it reduces the world to atoms,
Yeah.
and it reduces experience to the brain or the mind. So yes, and I think that being non-Cartesian or being non-reductive in those senses would mean kind of undoing that picture a bit, putting experience back in the world to some degree, there being meaning in the world, the world participating in my experience. And ultimately, when we're talking about mental disorders,
Yeah.
the reasons why I feel this particular kind of suffering at the moment has something to do with me, but it also has a lot to do with what's around me now and in the past. And that's a really important part of the story.
Hmm. I feel like, that your take on technology and tying that in with this non-reduction or this holism, integrating everything. My take is that the technological advances we've had is that they look great and they look amazing because we don't know actually what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one of those things where like, yeah, we're doing amazing things. We got the internet and we got Wi-Fi, we got satellites up there, and
Mm-hmm.
we're doing quantum encryption and amazing technology. Yes. But then the question is like, what is actually possible?
Mm-hmm.
Because if so much more than that were possible, for example, sustaining the population, keeping the earth green, feeding everybody, you know, many more other technologies that can be used. If energy could be cheap or inexpensive or even free,
Yeah.
like these things I think are next level kinds of technologies,
Yeah.
healing, well-being, medicine. One thing I always tell my family when we drive around is we see these telephone poles with wires.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what century are we in? They look like antiques. It's like
Yeah.
these wood poles with these, the wood is decaying. A storm comes and a wood pole falls down.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what century is this that we're
Right.
living in?
Right.
So I think there's this perspective out there that our technology is fantastic and it's advanced. I think when we look at what is actually possible, I actually don't think we're that advanced, but we're so
Yeah.
mesmerized by all the stuff that's happening. And I
Yeah.
think your phrase exactly, if we move to non-reductive strategies, non-reductive ways of seeing the world, and of course applying that to psychotherapy as well, then so much more would be possible. And we would see that, oh, wow, we thought we were very advanced, but in fact,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps we were not.
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree. I think the type of advance that we are is incredibly specific, and I take your point as well that it's like it seems like every generation will think, oh my God, how advanced everything is, and oh my God, the world's going to end really soon.
Right.
And like
Right.
everybody's been thinking that
Right.
for a long time. And I agree. I have to admit that I'm to some degree a bit of a pessimist with regards to how positively it can be used, just because it's I feel like so much of the harms, some of which you mentioned or implied, are so kind of dissociated that it's hard to think that we can have that kind of holistic view. And when we do have that holistic view, how much time and money is going to be put into increasing the technology rather than something potentially more personally valuable.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my own kind of
Yeah.
take on it. But
Yeah.
yeah.
This also reminds me of the what in Vedanta we call the subject-object relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like in this case, the subject being mind and object being matter, or subject being the aliveness and object being something that we think is dead or inanimate.
Right.
I was recently reading Physics and Philosophy by Sir James Jeans,
Mm.
and it's a very short book. I think you might actually like it if you haven't checked it out. He has a couple paragraphs on subject object, and he
Mm-hmm.
says that something like, I'm paraphrasing, that to really see what's happening, the truly objective perspective would be to include the seer,
Yeah.
include the subject, as opposed to the common notion of objective, which is that you just look at part of the
Yeah.
picture, half the
Yeah.
picture, so to speak. But he actually replaces the idea that talking about the subject would be a subjective experience. He says, no, that's true objectivism because you are looking
Mm-hmm.
at the whole picture now and not
Yeah.
just half the picture.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I see that in, there's a lot of, it happens in psychology as well. In psychology as a discipline where, the in those words, the seer, the kind of the consciousness and the relationship is not accounted for when the consciousness and the relationship actually alters the object in a certain respect. And so there isn't ever really a final analysis in that way that's possible as long as you're including it.
Yeah.
In a similar way. So you can't be objective unless you include the perception within it.
Yeah.
If that's the case, it's infinitely increasing, right? Because there's never a final
Yeah.
object.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how would all this that we're talking about in terms of practical effects on psychotherapy, how might a person incorporate this both from a psychotherapist perspective, but also from a client who's looking to open up their own perspective?
Yeah, I think that, so one of the articles I think you read was about Winnicott.
Yeah.
And Winnicott was a fantastic guy, really interesting guy. I would recommend reading him, although he's very, very difficult to read in some ways, but he's such an interesting way of talking that kind of opens some of this up.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of being a psychotherapist, I was trained psychoanalytically in this kind of relational school. So not the Freudian stuff, not like me sitting outside, pronouncing what's going on to the person. But the relational perspective is all about healing through shifting patterns in relationship, through kind of repairing gaps in relationship, which very much comes with the idea that, or comes from the idea that, experience is socially generated in some way, and that I don't really have my own private experience in a certain way. It's very much sort of tied and influenced by what's going on around me, and particularly the people. So in terms of psychotherapy, I see it as what's primarily healing, as we know, is the relationship, but particularly going through different kind of relational experiences with a therapist, as opposed to trying to get things right and assess errors or dysfunctional thoughts or things like that. Those things can be helpful, but something that focuses on this kind of relational social experience that kind of undercuts that Cartesian dualism and undercuts this, the world is kind of irrelevant. The world's really important, and it can have a really big benefit on how you feel. Yeah.
And so when you say relational experiences, is this relating with other people, like a person relating with other people? Is it relating with even things that we consider inanimate? What are the kinds of relationships that fall under that category?
Yeah, I tend to think big about things, and I think that it very much focuses on, I think the most important quote unquote objects in somebody's world are the important relationships one has. So of course that's very, very important with parents, with a therapist, with lovers. But I also think maybe equally as large, and certainly in the background of it all, is the relationship to the natural world and to what's going on around us. Walking around in nature, where you feel like you're participating in a kind of meaningful, conjoined experience with living beings, is a very different kind of experience than walking around with a bunch of inanimate sort of atoms.
Right.
And I think those experiences can be really healing. So I'm really interested in eco-psychotherapy, eco-psychology and stuff like that, which is a fairly new field, or at least it's taking on more gravity only recently.
And I want to clarify something. When you say that, walking around and feeling connected with nature is different and has a healing effect, as opposed to feeling like this is inanimate atoms or disconnected from these atoms. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're saying that it's not just the subjective experience of the world being alive or not alive, but you're saying there's actually a different experience to be had, that the world itself is not what we think it is, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where I'm going. Once you start breaking down that Cartesian thing, you repopulate the world with your own meaning, what we have taken to be our own meaning, our own values, our own purposes, and our own experience is repopulated back into the world. And then just as you think about the psyche being relationally sort of therapized in a therapy, but so true with animals and trees and whatever. If some of the experience you have is actually being participated in by the world around you, by nature, and vice versa, then absolutely. I think that's the profound thing that comes with the breakdown, is that the world isn't like that. And I would say that insofar as we walk around thinking the world is like that, we cut ourselves off from potentially very nourishing kinds of experiences, such as you can have in nature. At least it's kind of in the back of your mind, and you don't really know. Maybe something changes, but you kind of like, you put it to the back of your mind. You don't actually allow yourself to be nourished by it. So yeah, I think to me it's kind of mind blowing. Like undoing that, what becomes possible, or what was possible that you'd forgotten. I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that, to me, that word mind blowing is a literal description of what happens, because
Yeah.
one of the ways I categorize this is a shift from what I call the first mind to the second mind. And the second mind is an entire range of experience. It's not one experience, but the fundamental defining characteristic is that there's a shift in identity from what I think I am, and from where the sense of identity is localized or restricted to, from only within the body to trans body to beyond the body.
Yes.
And that's literally mind blowing from the perspective of the localized, finite, individuated mind.
Absolutely. And the prefix trans becomes very, very important. I find myself either putting it in front of a bunch of words or wanting to put it in front of a bunch of words.
Yeah.
This kind of trans subjectivity where you can't locate it for the reason that it's participated in by everything in the field of experience. So it becomes fun to talk about, or annoying to other people around me.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things I notice on Twitter, is like with conversations like this, like people are very entrenched in whatever that one perspective might be. And I think literally because it is this mind-blowing effect where one has to give up a lot of assumptions, including about one's own experience growing up, how we relate to the world, what has happened in our lives, to experience a different kind of perspective and to go beyond that individuated and dualist perspective.
Yeah, and I think I'll speak personally, but I believe it kind of comes with the territory that there's a lot of value that comes from sort of shifting perspective in that way. And we're talking about different things or different levels of it, but there's also a loss that comes with it. Losing, at least I've been experiencing that recently, of realizing how much time I've spent kind of in this very, very narrow kind of internally stimulated, regulated place. And the loss of time spent in a different kind of place.
Yeah.
So that's an important part of it for me anyway.
What I experienced also is there's the loss of the comfort of the stories that we were given. Even if the stories aren't working, and even if they may not be true, there's still the discomfort with change, with upheaval, like giving up so much, giving up literally everything, because that identity that's rooted has its own interpretation of all the stories. And so that's one thing I felt, is giving up all of these, and what's really on the other side, and is this something that really has to happen? That kind of process was also there.
Right. Yeah, it's a scary thing. I think it is a scary thing. I noticed myself knowing that I should quote unquote shouldn't be doing what I'm doing at certain points. That kind of comes from that, and knowing that I could actually feel better if I didn't do it, but just being kind of fearful of that. even though I know it's a good thing.
Right. Yeah. All right. I want to get into some of these lines that you wrote to get your take on these. You just mentioned the Winnicott article. So James wrote an article in Psyche magazine, online magazine. I think it's at psyche.co. Yeah. And you can search for his name and find it. The title of the article is, "For Donald Winnicott, the psyche is not inside us, but between us." And I wrote three quotes. I think we've touched on some of these, but I'd like to get your take on them. One is Winnicott's divergence from subject-object dualism is perhaps most clearly illustrated by his firm belief that we never extricate ourselves from this transitional realm and its subject-object mix-up. So we would, if you could speak to this part, that we never extricate ourselves from this transitional realm. Like it's like we never left it actually, even though we might talk about it differently.
Yeah. Yeah, so the transitional realm for him, it's a tricky thing because he describes it as paradoxical, like you can't formulate it, which then leads on to, I mean, it becomes a kind of mystical thing in a certain way, although he wasn't. He was a very sober kind of theorist in many ways. But the transitional realm, yeah, is kind of where he's thinking of it in terms of the original kind of mix up of experience between mother and baby, and that they're in a sense a kind of one continuous being, and that there isn't this kind of subject object distinction even for the mother at some points, or father, or whoever it is. And one of the most influential things he talks about was this transitional space, transitional objects, which is, to put simply, things that are in between those two things, in between subject and object. The example that he gives is the kind of, that people will be familiar with is, like blankie, this kind of, what we would think of as an inanimate object, but it carries with it so much meaning and value, and it's this kind of incredibly potent security attached to it. So it's like half an object and half a subject in those terms. But he expands this whole theory to include the whole of culture, actually, that, the arts and music and really politics, all of it is an extension of that very same thing, extension of the same place, and that it's always in between. And I think sometimes of watching a movie, how we watch a movie and we're watching it and we're captivated by the story, but we rarely think this is a bunch of actors just doing this, thing. They're putting on this show for us, and it's objectively, it's not at all what I'm experiencing it as. And that's that kind of quality of transitional, where you're kind of captivated by imagination. And so he thought that was really important in psychological growth as well. And his whole theory was around sort of trying to harness that kind of imaginative creativity as a fertile place of growth for one individually, but also between client and therapist, just like between mother and child, where you kind of, his word would be play. It's like the psychoanalyst who's playing with his words and playing with the experience and not taking things seriously and not even thinking, is this my experience or their experience? Just kind of going with this organic narrative that you're creating together, and that in itself is really very healing. And as well, behind pretty much all experience we have, it kind of, in a funny way, the dualism that we have, this idea that the world is this kind of inanimate thing, is a story within that transitional space. That's the particular story that we're playing with, that exists within it. The transitional space precedes the story, that story.
Yeah. So does this transitional space, if we had to localize the space, is it literally out here? Is it in this area that we consider outside the body, or is it, again, trans body, where it includes the body and includes the sense of an individual psyche, or can we localize it somewhere?
Yeah, I think, it comes down to that trans thing, where it's both. It's both, and of course it has to take place in a physical space. You can't really do it over the phone, I wouldn't say. It takes a certain embodied, visceral participation to generate it in a physical space. But you can't find it in that physical space. It's experience that's partly in me, partly in the other person, and partly, I would say, in the space. So it's getting very abstract, but it's it's well, in some psychoanalytic, more modern psychoanalytic theory, they talk about fields of experience. You're participating in a field of subjectivity where it's all kind of coming together, and you kind of organically, something comes out of that. So it's physically there or physically bounded in some way, but it's not locatable. Yeah, it's magical stuff, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, in
yeah,
my view, the world is magical.
yeah,
The world is entirely magical. When you think about the planet spinning on its axis and then
yeah,
also spinning around the sun, and then the sun is flying around the Milky Way,
yeah.
and here we are sitting, and the body feels like it's grounded in some way on the
Hmm.
earth. I mean, it's pure magic. I mean, to me, the Big Bang is pure magic. It's an
Yeah,
idea, it's a story that we tell,
yeah.
and if you put it in a children's book, everybody would recognize it as magic. But if
Hmm.
it's in a science book, we don't allow the mind to go there to consider that it's magical.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and that's one of the ways in which science forecloses on things. It gives explanations, but in those explanations, it forecloses or occludes the actual very fact of it happening, and the fact
right,
that isn't part of an explanation, the very thing, is
right.
itself kind of lost, and that is very magical.
Yeah. One of the things I think that happens is that it's not science itself, but it's that science is always interpreted by people who
Hmm.
have a materialist philosophical perspective. So it's like the science itself doesn't tell us about mind first, matter first, whether they're
Yeah.
synonyms, whether they're antonyms. Science doesn't comment on that. But we as people give definitions to these things first based on our own experience of the world.
Hmm.
And then if we happen to be experts and scientists, we start speaking without realizing that we're actually speaking about philosophy.
Yeah,
We're
absolutely.
actually not interpreting the science
Yeah.
independent of our philosophical perspective.
Absolutely right. I'm glad you said that, because it's wrong to. It was not right for me to say science, because it very much is the way that we deal with it and experience it, and what we attribute to the things that are there, like you say, that are indifferent to the implications
Yeah. Yeah.
or what it means.
Yeah.
We bring that to it. So I definitely think that's right.
Yeah, I think about the adults in our lives when we're children, whether it's parents or guardians or our teachers. Nobody ever sat down and said, hey, Anoop, hey, James, today we're starting materialism. All right.
Hmm.
What
Yeah.
you are is a body. You started on this date, and you're probably going to end in between these two dates over here. And
Hmm.
nobody ever gave us that prelude that, hey, I'm going to teach you materialism. It's one way to see the world. If
Hmm.
they just gave us those two lines, I'm going to
Hmm.
teach you materialism. It's one way to see the world. I feel like it would be okay, because then people would, as they grow up, be like, okay, they taught me materialism. What is the other perspective? But they just say, hey, it's Tuesday. This is life. Here it
Hmm.
is. And,
Stick with
and I think
it.
that's what causes the problem.
Yeah, no, I can see that, certainly. I think that's really interesting. I'm actually just about to have a child coming up soon. My wife's heavily pregnant,
Congratulations.
so I think I will tell my child that exact
Yeah.
thing as soon as they can understand. Yeah,
Yeah, I like to think of it as we're all telling stories. I
yeah.
mean, the best we can do is, at least in terms of words and concepts, is tell
Hmm.
stories. And then hopefully the way we're experiencing and relating with others can fill in the rest
Hmm.
of it, that gives those words meaning.
Yeah, and I think that the way you just said that as well, that's a way of you could use that to describe or think about the relational therapy, in the sense that it is, you want to, it's important to know what happened and the experiences, but you're not approaching it as like concrete events that happened that need this done to them. It's about weaving stories, and perhaps weaving a new story, or weaving a new narrative, and whatever things that will need to happen in order to get there.
Yeah.
And I do think it takes a very relativistic kind of radical position on that, where it really is just about coming together to tell a different story,
Yeah.
and obviously that taking a long time
Yeah.
to be able to, or potentially a long time.
That's beautiful. Let me look at this. I want to get to the big questions too, so I want to make sure I don't forget about that. But I want to look at least a couple more of your quotes here. Let's see. So you talked about this. This is from another article from James that he wrote called How the Dualism of Descartes Ruined Our Mental Health.
I didn't choose that title, by the way.
Oh, you didn't? The editor put that in?
Yeah, pretty severe title. Yeah,
Yeah, I thought so too. I was
yeah,
like, it doesn't sound to me like the tweets I've seen you tweet. It
yeah,
sounded, so that makes sense. But I want to read this paragraph, and it's not the whole paragraph. I'm leaving a couple sentences out. Please check out the article, aeon.co, I think is the site.
yeah.
Um, so you wrote, the episteme that now prevailed was, in Rorty's terms, solely concerned with truth as correspondence
Mhm.
and knowledge as accuracy of representations. Psyche, as such, became essentially introverted and untangled from the world. As a result, its experiential and epistemological dimensions were not only denied validity as an experience, but became the occasion for error, in quotes, occasion for error. And finally, this is where Foucault located the beginning of the modern conception of madness. Talk to me about the modern conception of madness.
Yeah. Yeah, we've actually talked about it. I think. I mean, that is a quote that is a particular part of what we've been talking about in terms of the Descartes thing.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, Foucault's description there, the modern madness, the modern conception of madness, is that um, that experiences can be wrong. You know, they can be erroneous. It comes from this picture, the Cartesian picture of, as the world is out there and experience is in here, um, I have to represent the world, and that representation can be either true or false. And so when somebody has a mental disorder, then it's because something's gone wrong in that representing. There's been an error. There's been an internal error of representing. It follows from the model. And that is the model we're still entrenched in after all this time. Um, so yeah, talking about the occasion of error, that wasn't something that was in it before. As I understand it, I'm obviously no expert. You know, the time before that shift in paradigm, there was this sense, there was a relational participatory sense between subjectivity and nature, and God was thought to be immanent in nature as well, and that experience wasn't just located inside of us. We were meaningfully participating with other beings, other people in a purpose that transcends us, or a meaning that transcends us each. Kind of like how I'm describing where we want to go back to. um, you know, it still exists in the quote unquote pagan view of the world. It's all about being immersed in nature and participating with nature, and there being signs in nature, and nature being able to tell you things. And so it doesn't, the idea of there being an erroneous representation of nature doesn't really make sense in that mode of experiencing and thinking. It's something that's wrong, like logically wrong or representationally wrong, is still something that's real, something that's been generated out of an experience.
yeah.
So that picture very much breaks down, um, and so does the whole everything that came after it. Yeah.
All right, so this has led us inevitably to the big questions. So here we go. James Barnes' take on what is mind?
What is mind? That is the $1 million question, or I guess it would be $1 billion question now.
Right.
I think there are. I mean, it really gets into, without being too pedantic, the words, the etymology. Do we mean mind? Do we mean psyche? I know in the Vedantic tradition, there's several different words that we'd translate to mind in Sanskrit. And so there's a lot of different things in that. But to use the word psyche, which I like to use, as it was previously, had a lot more meaning and a sort of transpersonal meaning to it, as well as an individual. I think that I take it to be experience, you know, where experience is identified to be, and the identifying capacity or quality, right? So it's something that we experience internally now, It's something that I'm aware of, that it has a kind of internal capacity to it. But I also think of it as something that extends beyond the body, extends beyond the brain, and includes within it the fields of experience we walk around in. And in some way, it's generated from that. So I would say that the mind is inherently transpersonal, or the psyche is inherently transpersonal. But there are other aspects, such as I know are differentiated in Sanskrit, where the kind of thinking function,
Right.
reflective function, that
Right.
I think you can locate
Yeah.
in the person. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the fantastic things about a word like mind or consciousness is that just appreciating the innumerable ways in which we might define it
Yeah.
and how people might experience it and how much of it is not described in popular culture or even scientific culture.
Mm-hmm.
That awakening in itself holds so much potential for all of
Yeah.
the things that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, to me, a really interesting way of going into that. Of course, you can read philosophy of mind and all of that, but that's such a big task.
Yeah.
But just going into what mind is in different languages,
Yeah.
in different cultures, and looking
Yeah.
at the etymology
Yeah.
of where mind comes from and where psyche comes from and the history of it.
Yeah.
So much of it is contained in that, and that's quite easily accessible. Yeah.
And where does transpersonal psychology or transpersonal, I don't think it's psychiatry, I think it's transpersonal
Mm.
psychology. Where does that fall into all this?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because that means a lot of different things as well,
Okay.
especially in San Francisco.
Okay.
But I use the word just in the same way that I think you would, in terms of it's beyond the person. So
Yeah.
it's something that one experiences, but you cannot identify it as located in one. It has other locations. It's used in different ways as well to mean, you know, not non-dual states of consciousness,
Yeah.
psychedelic states and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But there's a whole field of that.
Yeah. It seems to me that that has to become mainstream psychology. Like,
Mhm.
to me, it doesn't make sense to not account for
Yeah.
other ways of experiencing identity and awareness and mind
Mhm.
in something like psychology and psychiatry.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, they've been historically um, dissociated from the narrative, historically suppressed, for sure. It's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting to me, actually, going back not too many decades, even Freud's time. The transpersonal stuff was very common, very mainstream. In fact, Freud, although he didn't admit it publicly, he was known to believe in telepathy and stuff like that. And it was very, very common and kind of accepted right up until the First World War or something. And then things really, really took a turn, understandably. But it is there, I think, and it's there in our common language. We all talk in those terms all the time, but we
Yeah.
kind of reason it away if we think about it as that's it's just not true.
Right.
We know that we have experiences that are complex, and we know we get certain feelings that seem to be put in us from other people.
Right.
It's there.
Right.
Um, yeah, but I
Yeah.
agree, it does need to.
It seems like we have the experiences that we have, but we don't have the stories to account for them
Right.
in a way that feels right and in the way that's consistent with all the science. The stories are
Yeah.
lacking.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing. It's, if you don't have a story to speak it in, then it drifts off somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we solved what is mind. The next
No
question,
problem.
the next question is, what is the world?
What is the world?
And maybe it's not a different answer. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they become really linked in that way. I'm not an idealist in the sense of idealism, in the sense of thinking that the world is a function of mind or a product of mind as such. But I certainly think that the world and the nature has experiential mental qualities, so to speak. It's just that there's a differentiation between the individual and the world. But I take the psyche to be more of a fundamental substrate than matter. So the world, I don't know what to make of that, but some combination of those things.
Yeah. Is it possible that our experience of psyche, which seems to be localized, is simply what we might call a phase of the mind or a state of the mind?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's perceived differently, then could the world itself, not just a individual subjective experience, but could the entire world be mental? I know you said you were not an
Mm-hmm.
idealist. Is that possible in the way you see things and the stories that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do follow the Vedantic distinction, which I was saying to you beforehand. I struggle to hold the two things in mind at the same time. Um, but I do think that I do think that the world is mental in that sense. I don't think the world is mental in the sense of it's a projection of my
Right.
mind particularly, which is what, or
Solipsism.
human minds. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would see it as something along the lines of, it's the mind of Ishvara in Vedanta, and that I have my own projection within that.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. I think seeing it as a kind of phase or mode of a different kind of mind
Mhm.
or different level of mind, I would follow that. Yeah.
So two scales of mind. Now we're building castles in the sky for fun. So two phases of mind or levels of mind. One is James' perspective, one is Anoop's perspective, and everybody who's watching has their own perspective,
Mhm.
and all that, which is illuminated within another mind, in
Mhm.
which we are distinct, like individuated personalities, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I think that's also, in a different way, but it's historically there. Even like I was saying before, the Cartesian shift, they did in Christian Europe. There was this sense of an immanent God and the world being God's thoughts, and there certainly was going way back, and Plato's time, the anima mundi, like the soul of the world, Mother Nature. I mean, all these words speak to a kind of another or a grander encompassing psyche or being in which we are little psyches and beings.
Hmm.
And you don't have to get theistic necessarily about that.
Right.
You can think of it in terms of just as characterized by experience and intelligence
Yeah.
as opposed to inert matter.
Right. It's interesting you bring that up because I feel like that's one of the issues that comes up is when we start talking about these things and exploring these things, inevitably the labels of religion or spirituality or philosophy even come up.
Right.
But actually all these are actually categories of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And if we put experience first, which every human being does, but we don't think about it as such,
Yeah.
if experience is our guide and we find different ways to categorize it and talk about it, then those labels themselves don't necessarily have to come into play.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I think as well. There's a philosophical decision, at least. Which do you start with? The matter that you experience in the outside world, or the experience in which it happens? And there's nothing to tell you which to do.
Yeah.
Um, have you come across somebody called Alfred North Whitehead?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I read
So,
some of him.
yeah, he's a very tough person to read, but his very influential mathematician and physicist who exactly took that point and just he starts with experience first, and he
Yeah.
has his whole own metaphysics. But the idea that we're not talking about atoms, we're talking about drops of experience, and that's the basic,
Right.
the fundament of the world is experience, and there's no reason not to do that.
Right.
Nothing's telling us not to do that. And he was a scientist, a very influential one. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see the matter first or the experience first on the same level
Mhm.
because when we come into this world, what we know is experience. We
Right.
don't have the label of experience,
Right.
but we have no concept of matter as such.
Mm-hmm.
We start out with these sensations and these feelings, etc. And at some point, we start to think, we experience the world in a particular way that, you know, there's a world in here maybe and a world out there. And now I'm told that, you know, this in here is sensation, what you feel. And that out there is something called matter. And then
Yeah.
further, I'm told that, yeah, what you're feeling in here actually comes from out there. It's actually
Mhm.
matter that comes first. So there
Right.
seems to be this inversion that happens.
Yeah.
When I look at these two independently, it seems to me that experience is all anybody really knows. And then
Mhm.
part of that experience is the experience of a concept. It's a very subtle experience. And then that concept is, to me, matter, which is a kind of a collection of
Mhm.
sensations. That's the way I see it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's that story that you told. That is the Cartesian story that was followed by the British empiricists. That whole tradition, which we still in many ways are in,
Yeah,
that is the story that they tell. That's how they did it for whatever reason.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Last big question for you, James. Um, your bio said reimagining the nature of mental disorder. So now we're going to say you have the ability to do anything with the mental health system, whatever we want to call it, including relabeling it, whatever we want to call it.
Mhm.
You can do anything with it, either just in the UK or all over the world, anything. So if you could reimagine this system, labels, education, practice style, finances, etc., what to you are the three keys, the three big steps in turning this thing around and with a focus on actually healing the
Mhm.
people that are involved?
Mhm. Okay. Big question. Um, I would say that, I mean, firstly, we need to let go of, or at least radically change our idea of what a mental disorder is in terms of its location in the brain or the mind, something that's gone wrong, something related to individual factors of the organism. That I think needs to change, and I think the research is in fact telling us to make that change anyway. Um, but I think that's the most important thing. And then I think, secondly, which follows from that, is when you're no longer identifying it in the individual as such, then a lot of the a lot of attention and momentum needs to be refocused to relational and social conditions. You know, rather than you know, looking for genetic predispositions, which has its place, but focus and money and attention and time needs to go into figuring out how these things arise in the social situations in which people are in. And thirdly, how that works out in terms of a mental health system is very, very, very challenging. And there's 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 more than just philosophy and ideology beneath this, because we all participate in a system that looks for quick solutions for ourselves and others, quick relief, um, you know, easy answers to things, or straightforward answers to things at least. And I think, to me, the reality of the suffering that we're feeling is a huge question and a huge problem that involves a lot of work for us all to do on a collective level. So I have no idea how that part happens.
All right.
Yeah.
James, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing your perspectives. You have very insightful and important perspective today. Um, how can people get in touch with you or learn more about your perspectives? You know, what are your social media handles? Can you tell us?
Yeah. So my Twitter, I'm only on Twitter, and it's at psychgeist52. So psych and then geist, like poltergeist, Geist 52. So I post on there pretty regularly and put my articles. Actually, I have a Facebook page which is just my name.
Okay.
Um, you can find me on there. Yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah,
Pleasure.
I think we could have gone, we didn't even touch on Vedanta and reconciling the minds and all that. Maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Yes, I'd love that. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, James. I'll see you next time.
All right. Bye bye.